Hello. It is very lovely to be here in Port Fairy for this festival with this panel. I usually present Life Matters on RN, so I'm actually wearing pants today, looking like a human. It's very odd. Thank you for bearing with me. As you heard, we've got an amazing panel today. Jennifer Down, her novel Bodies of Light, just won the Miles Franklin. Christine. I might have to get you to keep all the clapping for the end because I've been told that we do have to finish on time today, so we'll just kind of condense it a bit. Christine Balint, whose novella is Water Music, and Lucy Treloar, author of Wolf Island and Salt Creek. And between them, there are just too many awards and shortlists to mention, so we're just going to stick with yay, what a stellar panel. I'm going to kick off with you, Christine. What drew you to writing? It's okay. What drew you to writing about Venice? I mean, it's such a powerful thing in our imaginations. Why there?
So my initial interest in the story of Water Music came actually listening to the ABC one day and hearing some of Vivaldi's music. And the announcer after the music said, this music was composed for the orphan girls that lived at the orphanage where he worked. And then my ears pricked up and that was when I learnt that Vivaldi wrote almost his entire almost all his work was written for orphan girls who were very highly trained in music. So that was what set me on the path to researching that story.
And was there ever a sense that Venice might overtake the story? It's almost a character in itself, isn't it?
Yes, certainly. It's a great fun world to immerse yourself in, actually. So I enjoyed it. And yes, I think as it progressed, Venice did take over and become a character as well.
It's so evocative. I love that, you know, there's always the sound of water, there's the particular breezes of Venice that you name, and there's always the smell of fish.
Yes. That's
Yeah.
right.
Jennifer, your protagonist Maggie ends up living in a lot of places. Why did you choose these particular areas? I mean, there's houses, there's regions, Gippsland, there's countries, New Zealand, the States in various places. Why those places?
I think, sometimes it's kind of dictated by plot, certainly. So the first part of the book is set in outer eastern, outer suburban Melbourne, which is where I grew up, and so maybe that was those suburbs and places were very familiar to me, and maybe that was like an easy place to start. But it also made sense from like a narrative perspective. The homes and institutions that Maggie grows up in and lives in. I was more familiar with the history of institutions from that area, I suppose. And then, later on, I don't know what our spoilers policy is. Maybe I'll try to be, broad. It's a tricky one to not spoil. I think so. In about halfway through the narrative, the character Maggie decides to effectively like erase her old self and begin a new life. And practically, I did a lot of research into identity theft, I suppose, and what it means to practically reconstitute one's identity. And so there are practical considerations. If you're moving to a new place, you need to be able to speak the language and ideally as a kind of native speaker, or else you need to have a pretty convincing backstory. There are really complex considerations, and there are also logistical considerations around passports or obtaining travel documents or visas or whatever else. And so I looked at a lot of cases of people who had started a new life, both kind of domestically and overseas, and tried to, I guess, model her story on some of those.
I love how you're careful to say, this won't work these days, it's too digital. Yeah. You can't just get a death certificate now and waltz into a new life.
But you used to be able to. You used to, particularly in the United States, so I don't know, probably everyone else is like, we don't care, this is really boring, but I thought this was really interesting. In the United States, there was no centralisation of birth and death records prior to 9/11, really, and because identity theft, in a pre-credit card era, wasn't such a problem. Particularly if you were born in one state and died in another state, there was no real way of cross-referencing those events, and so it was relatively easy to just go and request somebody's death certificate and assume their identity until, you know, quite recently.
It's interesting that you said that, you know, the choice of places was driven by the plot, because sometimes it does feel like those places that she moves through, always through, like a backdrop to just her story or stories. Was that intentional?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in setting and geography generally, so it always has to, you know, play a role, and I would never want the setting to kind of feel shoehorned or forced. But yeah, no, certainly, like it. I don't know. I think I'm interested in setting as backdrop, but also in how setting functions sort of in dialogue with what's going on. And I think that happens really beautifully in both of these books. But I think about like Lucy's Wolf Island, for instance, and how I don't know, like Kitty and the climate and the setting. I don't know, dialogue is precisely the word. I think they're all kind of mediated by and for one another. And I think that's what I aim to do, but yeah.
Well, and water music it's so evocative of place, but also that place in time, isn't it? I mean, the Venice then bears no relation to Venice now, and Venice in 100 years, who knows? But yeah, tell us a bit more about that story and how it's particular to that time that Lucetta lived in.
Actually, I would say Venice in some ways hasn't changed that much, because so there were 4 of these musical orphanages, and those buildings are still all there. The one that I ended up focusing on, so a lot of kind of my early decisions around this work were actually just they were practical considerations, and they happened by accident. So when I did begin the work on writing about Venice, I actually had 2 projects in mind. And one of them was set on Phillip Island, weirdly. And I was living on Phillip Island at the time, and I wrote a proposal and I applied to Arts Victoria, and I didn't get any funding for that. And so I thought I'll see how I go with the other project. So the next round I put in to write about Venice to Arts Victoria, and that they funded it. So that was how I kind of went down that road in the beginning. And then there were various obstacles when I was actually over in Venice trying to do the research. So some of the buildings, one of the orphanages is now the main hospital. So, you know, they're not too happy with people kind of stomping around in there just to have a look around. I did sneak in, but obviously I couldn't spend a huge amount of research time in there. You know, they had important things to do. And one of them was an art school, and again, I snuck inside with my backpack and pretended to be a student, but I couldn't really kind of set my book there either. But the Derelitti orphanage, they had an archive there, and archivists, and a little kind of library, and they really were very, very welcoming. So that was why I decided to set my book in that particular orphanage. The buildings are all still there. It was, at that time, it was a nursing home. And it had been, when it was an orphanage, it had many purposes, and it did also house the elderly. So, you know, it was kind of quite haunting. You know, I'd be in the archive, and every now and then I'd hear kind of screaming, and, you know, things would be going on in other parts of the building, which kind of almost felt as though they were travelling through time. Like it just had a sense of timelessness about it that made it easy to imagine my way into that place. And also the actual research process itself is quite different from what we would, I guess, coming from Australia and having come through our kind of education system, where you might jump on a catalogue and look up what's in the library and then order it and then turn up and there it is. But in Venice, it was kind of like, here's a box, have a look, see what's inside. And so I was just wading through random collections of paper. There was, you know, permission slips for the girls to be allowed to go on a seaside holiday for their health. There was applications for marriage, which were often rejected by the nuns. The nuns were very particular about who was allowed to get married and who wasn't. If they were very valuable as a musician, the nuns wouldn't really want to let them go because they were an important commodity. So that was how I ended up in there. And then I guess the imaginative process, which was so much a part of this for me, just came from the circumstance of being in that place.
Well, and when we think about a certain sense of being in that place, Kitty is so of her place on Wolf Island. Can you tell us a bit about Wolf Island for people who haven't read the book, what it looks like and feels like to be there?
Wolf Island, I got the idea for Wolf Island from a photograph that I saw online one day. I was at a tiny island that contained only a house and a tiny little bulldozer that had pushed the dirt up in these ramparts around the island just to keep it dry enough for a little bit longer. And I was just procrastinating one day, which I'm a big believer in, and came across it, and I thought, oh, that's my next book. And then I thought, oh my goodness, and I just had that kind of harpooned feeling, and knew that I had to make it work somehow, but I instantly thought, I'm in so much trouble, and just started reading more about this region. And I quickly pictured Kitty, this character, in an upstairs window looking out at the kind of remains of her once rich world, wondering where it had all gone wrong. And it developed from there. And then I did a couple of research trips there and rode around this island. And I feel like visiting these places is incredibly important. You kind of ride them, you walk them into yourself, you feel, obviously it's not the same as actually living there, but I chose an island and then basically depicted that island.
It's interesting that you said you rode that island or walked it. It's not about driving, is it? It's about being in the place.
Yes, and standing still and listening and and I went exploring through these old ruined houses, and every now and then I'd see a local and say, I'm going in, if you don't hear from me for a while, can you come and check I'm okay? Because the stairs are all falling from the roof, from the second floors, and they're pretty precarious. But there's something about doing that kind of research that returns you to a childlike state, I think. You give yourself permission to do really weird stuff. Yeah.
Well, you're writing about a place that's in the now, but you're also writing about a place that's rapidly becoming a lost place.
Yeah, that's
What's
right.
that like?
Well, it is not exactly what I thought it would be. I thought, they're all going to be in a state of terrible mourning about their lost past and the way of life crumbling and all of that. But they're pretty chipper, actually. they just think, climate change is a load of baloney. So
Even
it's
though
nothing
it's
they can do.
on their porch.
Yes, but it has been changeable for a really long time. Islands have been waxing and waning there for centuries. And it is that problem that we have with not being able to perceive things quickly enough. The change is too slow for them to think of it as a current disaster that's generated by changes in climate. So they're just, every now and then they get in hydraulic lifts and they jack their houses up and move them back from the coast, and you see these signs out to sea saying real estate. It's just so broken and crumbling and dissolving and beautiful, and they love it. They're out there in their dissolving world and they're sort of happy.
I found that fascinating about this book. It's part elegy, but it shows the beauty. It's this kind of celebration of the place as it is now, this crumbling, near lost place, as well as what it was.
Yeah, I think that is something that we all feel, isn't it? This kind of, and I'm so struck by it any time I'm on social media, that the way people love the world that we live in. We take photographs, you just look at this beautifulness that I saw today or yesterday, or I must get out. We want to be in touch with that world. And so we're out loving it, but we're also kind of grieving over it at the same time, I think.
Yeah, there was so much going on in this book for me. I mean, it is this dystopian but not far off the truth near future world where, displaced people are under great threat and terror, and there's deportations and terrible acts.
It's what's happening. So it didn't feel dystopian to me. I wrote it as reality.
Yeah. It's just, I don't know, with the climate change aspect and the kind of crumbling of this actual world as well as the social world, it really struck a chord with me. I noticed, obviously the natural world is a big part of how you evoke place in Wolf Island. What are some of the key details that you feel help you give a sense of place when you're writing a place?
I think there is so much about process for me, and I think think what I've learned to do is follow the kind of obsessional things that I do. And so there was this walkway that I came across one day when I was on a research trip there, quite by accident. And I would think, oh, I've got this list of other things I have to look at. And then the next day I'd think, I might just go back and look at that walkway. And I just kept on doing that kind of thing, just to pay attention to the things that you're paying attention to, I suppose. So I take a lot of photographs, I take a lot of notes. I look, when I'm actually in places, I think a lot about how I'm going to express the things that I'm thinking, the ways to describe things. And then at the end of it all, when I'm in a state of flat despair, I go back to my notebooks and think, oh, there's a little glimmer in there maybe I can work with. Claw my way back into that world. Yeah, but I depend a lot on that kind of documentary stuff that I do when I get back.
I just want to read one sentence that stood out for me as an incredible evocation of place. First light arriving on the plain of Wolf Island, like a can of paint wash water of purest watermelon pink flung in an enormous delicate rush. The whole book is full of things like that. You should go and read it. It's amazing. Jennifer, what about for you? What are the details that you feel really help you give a reader a sense of where they're at right now?
I was just nodding in deep agreement because I feel like Lucy and I never met Lucy before today, but I feel like I work in a very similar way in terms of kind of that magpie approach to not quite knowing why or even what I need, but feeling compelled to take note of it and kind of salt it away for later. So I was kind of just staring off into space thinking, yes, I've been read like a book. I think it's everything for me. It has to be, I don't know, at the risk of sounding like a wanker creative writing tutor, it has to be kind of multisensory. It's the light, it's how it smells before it's going to snow, it's how a damp place, like the coast here or Melbourne, like that's a damp cold and the smell is quite different to a dry cold of, an alpine region. It is, what the streets smell like when you're walking around at night and people are cooking dinner, like I have one neighbour who always cooks lamb chops. I live in a tiny little apartment in a very small complex, and I know everything they're cooking. And I have never eaten lamb, and the smell is very particular and a little bit repulsive to me. And so God love her, but I know, Tuesday night's lamb chop night, and we all have our windows open. It's things like that kind of give a sense of verisimilitude, to writing. It's what I would want to. It's what I notice when I'm walking around, and I don't always know what that looks like or feels like or sounds like in the place that I'm writing about, because I agree with you both. The best thing you can do is to go to a place, and where possible I always try to do that, but it's sometimes, like, there have been times where that's not possible, and certainly with Bodies of Light, excuse me, as you said, it spans so many different places. I tried, I went to New Zealand, and I tried to steep it very much in geography with which I had some familiarity. But there are times when you can't access that for kind of purely financial, pragmatic reasons, like not getting a grant or not being able to take time off work or whatever it is. And so in those instances, it's kind of about, for me, if I'm walking around a place on a summer night, what am I picking up? What am I noticing? Whether it's, children's like chalk drawings on the ground or signs in windows. Like, I'm a dreadful perv when I'm walking around. I'm always looking in people's front gardens and, seeing how they've netted their fruit trees against the possums and things like that. And so it's about trying to transpose the detail that I am personally hungry for into a new place. I don't know if that made any sense.
Yep. Well, and I want to read a bit about the eastern suburbs. When Berwick was being mapped, the bones of houses had started to appear. So many rooms, or almost rooms, blank and awful. Pipes jutting like organs from a cadaver mid-autopsy. That's fantastic. completely lost my place. Cool. Christine, I love the bit in your book about the pantry. It just suddenly I was in that pantry, and it was, you know, a place in time with the baskets of mussels and the plates of, you know, marinated things. How much records are there? How good are the records on how people actually lived back then?
Well, actually, the nuns kept amazing records of those kinds of things. So some of the random documents that I looked through, there were ledgers, and they had a list of, because they were keeping track of the budget. That's, I think, the main reason. And it would be like, you know, we have this much soap, we have this many candles, you know, we have mussels, we have, you know, some strawberries. And, you know, also in that instance, you know, if there was not very much of a particular food, and it was considered a delicacy, it always went to the musician girls. So if you were unfortunate enough to not be trained in music and were, you know, kind of prepared for more kind of domestic life, then yeah, you missed out also on the treats, which was a bit sad. But yes, there were records of all of that in the ledgers from the nuns. Yeah. Unless your auntie worked in the kitchens, and then you had an in. That was a beautiful moment where all the girls hustle into the pantry. Oh my God. I just got stuck on the pantry. Lucy, how much does that sense of place change when Kitty starts to journey away from this place where she feels so comfortable, so at home, so kind of aware of all the seasons and natural world? It feels like there's a real change in her when she moves away.
Oh gosh, this is one of those, I've never been asked this, and now it is one of these weird things when you're writing that you're not really aware of what's happening. You're just following character. And for me, she had made a shift from that allegiance to place to belonging on Wolf Island, to being there to help her family, her newfound family, to reach safety. And that becomes her focus. So she's not belonging to land as much, although every now and then she wonders about putting little feet down, you know, perhaps we can restore this house. And that's pretty me, because I'm always thinking, definite reno opportunities with this one. There is a little bit of that real estate envy thing that goes on with their stuff. But I think with her it is just this kind of ferocious drive to move through place to other places, but to maintain a kind of awareness of where she is. She is very landscape aware. And I mean, I guess that comes from my belief that we are made by landscape as much as as landscape makes us. We make landscape and landscape makes us. I think there is this kind of intense relationship, and when she loses that relationship, she's kind of adrift and she has to acquire new purpose.
Yeah, it's almost like you can see her flailing, you know, without her roots in Wolf Island, but also trying so hard to be a different person and make human connections. And I was really struck by this sentence. You write about a tree that's been felled, but the birds still wheel over it. The tree had run through them like a path or a memory. It made them. Who was I now on the main? Kitty wonders when she leaves the island for the mainland. But, I mean, is it the landscapes or the relationships, the histories and stories that we have in a place that make us?
Well, I think it is a bit of both, and to not deny our connection to actual things, objects around us, even the things that we collect, is to sort of minimise what it is to be human. We have this terrible jackdaw sensibility. We love getting stuff. I find it really hard to leave my stuff behind, and you know, if I pack, I pack ridiculously because I'm like a snail. I've got to bring a whole lot of shell with me. And I think that's what she's like. And that idea of the tree came from a tree that was felled on Flemington Parade. I was driving down Flemington Parade day after day to my writing studio, and there was this campaign to save a particular eucalyptus tree that was very, very heavily used by local birds. And I just remember the day after it was felled, and there were these birds all just kind of screaming around this terrible loss. And I just thought, we're just birds, aren't we? We scream about our terrible losses. We're just animals.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just looking at the animal in us, I guess.
Yeah. I live along the Upfield railway line, and when they
Yes.
took all the trees out around the stations, there were people just lined up weeping
Yeah.
along the edge, 'cause it was like an assault,
It
you
was
know, this
dreadful.
absence in the sky. Yeah. Kitty was an amazing character for me. I really love how she's engaged in this internal struggle about the place, how much she's going to attach to the place. Are you drawing on something that you have experienced, or have you just got an incredibly powerful imagination?
I have a very deep attachment to a house in South Australia that's been in my family for generations. And I think any time I'm writing about a particular love and adoration, feeling of security for any place at all, I'm tapping into that feeling that I've got about this pretty ramshackle beach house that we all adore, and that means home to us. And I'm always struck by what people mean by home. They don't necessarily mean the place they live. They mean the place that they are most deeply attached to. And so I think that's probably a little bit of me and Kitty there.
Yeah, it's almost a bit like an allegory, Wolf Island, for growing up. You've got to leave behind this place that is going to disappear in some sense, physical or emotional, and move out into the world with all its dangers and work out how to navigate them, find your courage.
I feel very seen.
I feel seen by the packing thing.
No, it's very true. Yeah. I mean, we're all writing about ourselves in some way, aren't we? But I hadn't picked up that side of it.
Well, luckily you're writing about everyone else
I'll
too.
need
so it's
therapy
fine.
after this.
This is therapy. It's a safe space. Jennifer, I was having 90s Melbourne flashbacks all through this book. How does someone who was born in 1990 get that so right? I mean, where do you find those details that make people go, I know that shared house?
I think I'm like, I know I am deeply neurotic, and like we all are, right? I think just like wanting to get things right matters to me in the sense of detail, because I kind of feel like as a reader, if somebody's going to set something in a place that is, you know, recognisably real, and I quite enjoy reading fictionalised or made up places as well, but if someone's going to say like this is Melbourne or Dandenong in the 1970s, I want to if they're going to go out of their way to specify that, then I want some sense of an anchor, I suppose, or like proof that they know what they're talking about. And so that's how I try to write as well. And, you know, sometimes some stuff is easier than others. So the first part of the book is set in Dandenong in kind of the mid-1970s. And I certainly know Dandenong very well now. I grew up not far from there. My grandparents lived very close to there. That was like, I did my driving test at Dandenong RTA. I kind of have that, those certain places where you know where the slip lanes are and where this lane cuts out and somebody always does a dick move at this roundabout. That's kind of like where I'm most comfortable. But by the same token, I didn't know it in the 1970s. My mum happened to grow up there. She went to Lyndale High, one of the kind of ratbag high schools. And so she's very, she's not a writer, she's a reader. And I would, she and I would get in the car, and she was kind of amazing in that she would be like, okay, I'll drive. You just sit and take notes on your phone or in a notebook. And we would just kind of trundle around. And she also worked as a protective worker in Dandy through the 90s. And so she was able to be like, oh yeah, this was, the parents would shoot up here, and we used to put children in this motel because there was no emergency comm. This dreadful motel called the Prince Mark. Like you wouldn't put a dog there, but that was all there was in the 90s, particularly after the kind of guts were stripped out of social services by Kennett. And so like she would drive around with these very like hyper specific. She'd be like, oh yeah, I was once waiting on this corner with my friend so-and-so on the way to school, and because Dandenong was much more, was kind of quasi-rural or quasi-agricultural back then, a truck went past with cows, and my friend Susan got cow shit on her. It was, really specific details like that. And of course, not all of it makes it into the book, right? But she kind of knew what I was after. And so then when it got to the 90s, it was more a matter of, yeah, like it's heavy duty research, but I remember I spent about a year trying to work out when GHB, the drug, became available. And I ended up miraculously, like, mentioning it in conversation once as a random thing, like, this is the kind of stupid research I'm doing, to a colleague. And she was like, oh, my dad was an addict in the 90s, I'll ask him. So then I could go back to my editor with some confidence and be like, okay, GHB would have just been available in 92, but it is possible. So, like, I can leave it in there. I don't have to switch it out for something else. And she was like, okay, great, tick. So it's stuff like that where it's probably mental illness as much as anything else. But I just feel this, like, desire to really nut out the details and to feel confident and secure in what I'm writing.
Yeah, your mum should be funded by Arts Victoria.
Truly,
she's
yeah.
a resource. It's just that moment where she's like meeting her friend Alice at the window where you paste up your shared house requests. Like, oh, I remember that before the internet. It was full of landlines, this book. It was like, nostalgia. Yep. But it was interesting too how Maggie, I mean, the story is that she grows up largely in out-of-home care and she kind of moves through the world trying so hard to make attachments, but various constraints exist on that. How important do you think is that sense of belonging in a place to be able to form the sense of self that lets you make attachments, romantic or friendship?
I don't know, it's hard to say because I kind of, grew up in the one... I grew up in not in the one place, but in more or less the same, grid of suburbs. But I certainly have, friends who... a very dear friend of mine had... actually, I could get cancelled for this. Her mother, I don't play no part in this, I'm joking, but her mother worked for Monsanto Chemicals and was very high up, and they were expats and they moved around a lot. And she often, we went to kindergarten together, we're still very good friends to this day, even though we haven't lived in the same country since we were 9 years old. And she will still talk about that profound sense of kind of dislocation because she lived on multiple continents and she moved from Australia. They're an American family, but she moved from Australia to Argentina at age 9 and, had never spoken Spanish before and then was plunged into a Spanish-speaking school. Portuguese was the second language, English was the third. And, of course, that's not an unusual experience for, there are plenty of migrant children and families who had that experience. But, and certainly, they were a very wealthy family. She was never denied anything and she had all of the resources that the vast majority of people do not have, but still to this day she'll talk about this kind of sense of dislocation and not really knowing, not really having a great sense of stability because she, they've just popped around the world and like developmentally she and her sister, who are in their 30s, still fight in Spanish because that was where they learnt their swear words. Like that was, and they both do like multiplication in Spanish because that was the period in which they learned. And so there are these interesting things, and I often think about that and talk about it, with her, and we'll kind of say like that was the best possible scenario in the sense that they were being moved for kind of financial or like work-related reasons. There was nothing, there was no kind of great trauma other than, of course, the trauma of moving and leaving people behind. She wasn't like a refugee of war or, she was in this quite stable nuclear family, and she still has grown up with this profound sense of dislocation and as an adult moves around constantly, like can't put down roots. And so, yeah, I certainly, I think it must be very difficult for, my point is if it's difficult for her, who is by all accounts, very lucky, very well educated, very well looked after, it must be tremendously difficult for anybody who is, moved around or dispossessed or, especially, sorry.
No, go for it.
I was just going to say, especially if there's, like any kind of cultural loss as well or, Yeah, and I mean, obviously there's a lot that goes into an ability or an inability or a difficulty in forming relationships, not just about place. But I guess when I think about place with these books, it's also place is about the stories attached to that place, isn't it? Kitty has such a wide range of stories about particular parts of the island or superstitions or things you do at particular times of the year. How much of a role does that play for you, kind of attaching stories to a place and making them part of that world?
Yeah, I started thinking about this when I was writing Salt Creek, and I was thinking about the incredible layering and texturing of stories that the Ngarrindjeri people had about that place. I mean, they had thousands upon thousands of names for every single thing in that landscape that were partly documented in the 1920s. And every family develops little stories about places. And we made the road trip from Melbourne to South Australia, 10 times a year probably when we were children, backwards, forwards, sweating, panting dogs in the back, vomiting children, unair-conditioned car, the whole kind of thing. And we had names for places all the way along the road. Oh, the Parrot Tree, that's all of this stuff. And it is this human urge, I think, to name, not to own, but just to say we know this, to label things, to indicate in some way that we know places. And I think it was thinking about the paucity of our names, even though it felt rich to us, comparing that to the richness of the naming that had happened for millennia, that really kind of smashed me. It absolutely smashed me. And then there was the thought of the same kind of thing happening with Kitty on Wolf Island, all of those stories being obliterated, and because they're attached to particular points in the landscape. It's a loss not only of memory, of collective memory, it's a kind of a loss of the idea of place itself. And so, I mean, Kitty imagines it all drowned, and she's still thinking about place that drowned. She's thinking about that drowned future. Yeah, I find that's one of the kind of most awful things about the loss of landscape, I think, is that we lose ourselves as well.
Yeah, there's a very strong sense of yearning in the book that I think taps into a feeling a lot of people have about this anxiety about our world disappearing as we know it. But I felt like there was also hope too, because there was a kind of generational reattachment, and the child that's born through the course of the story, those generations that Kitty harbours on the island will take a part of it with them. Do you feel that's true?
I do, and I think, people persist, don't they? But it is this in those transitional states, it is very grim. And we're in one of those transitional states now, and I'm just so aware of all of the things that are being lost. I can't imagine what it's like in Pakistan at the moment. That the obliteration of their homes, all of their precious things that make them feel like they're connected to this particular place, this tiny little patch of the world that is theirs. Yeah, I think, but there is some hope, and but that, again, was one of those slightly surprising things when I was there, that they are pretty hopeful. But they have a hope that is born slightly of there being more land to move to. And as soon as you don't have somewhere else to move to, then you're in a truly desperate state. If you can get some compensation, buy a little patch of land. I found 80 acres of land there, and I sent a message home to my husband. What do you think? Do we want 80 acres of land? And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, it says it's prime duck hunting land. And then I thought about it. I'm not going to ever hunt ducks, but I thought what they mean is it's swampland and no one wants to build on it, and they're trying to offload it before it's absolutely submerged. Yep. But I went and had a look anyway.
The optimism of putting up a real estate sign there is pretty amazing. I was thinking about beautiful examples of place in water music, and one of them that stood out for me was the Sala della Musica, with this gorgeous mural of girls in elegant gowns and a little greyhound eating a biscotti on the walls. This beautiful detail that just leapt out. I could see this dog. A place is never just a pure setting, is it? That is quite a symbolic, meaningful room. Tell us how it functions for Lucetta.
So the Sala della Musica is still there, and it was actually commissioned. So a group of these musician girls decided they needed a beautiful room to perform in front of often it was the board, it was tourists, so they did have quite a big audience, and they set this in motion. The board agreed to it. They did fundraising. Unfortunately, it was only kind of finished, I think, about 20 years before Napoleon came through, and with Napoleon coming through, the whole system really just fell into disrepair and was abandoned, unfortunately. But it was in use for about 20 years, and it's still there. For Lucetta, it's an important moment. She's only just recently arrived at the orphanage. She's still finding her place she's teaching. She's also, yeah, and it's her first performance there, her first public performance. It's quite an overwhelming experience to go in, and then to see the kind of idealised version of these girls painted on the wall. So they look like kind of nymphs. They're in these amazing silk gowns, and as Hilary said, there's a little dog in the front. But of course, the girls actually were performing usually in what was more like a nun's habit, and they were also usually performing behind a grill, so their faces were not visible, because many of them were actually disfigured or disabled in some way, and they were considered unmarriageable, which was, must have been an awful label to get often as a small child. So a young girl would be told, you're the one in the family that's unmarriageable. But their singing and their music was supposed to be angelic. And so by kind of covering the appearance of them slightly, the audience was able to, experience only the sound, and to be kind of transported into this sort of more heavenly realm, just through the music and through the mural on the wall that they were supposed to be looking at, instead of looking at the grill and trying to see the faces of the girls.
A lot of those places in the book are places where the girls nominally come into contact with the outside world, but they're actually places of separation, aren't they? They're places of distancing, like the grill in the entryway to the convent, where Lucetta has to sit behind it when visitors come. Tell us more about that.
So they were actually literally locked in, although it was, I don't think it was put to them in that way. You're going to be locked in. And it was intended to protect them, because in fact they were considered a very, very important commodity, because Venice was, the pleasure capital of Europe in these centuries, so peaking in the 18th century. And in order to kind of atone for all the sin that was going on in, dark places in the city, the kind of girl choirs were supposed to be sending beautiful music to God, which was kind of going to atone for all this evil that was going on amongst other people in the city. So keeping the girls safe and protected from men in particular was very, very important. And the girls who sang were they were housed higher up in the building, so that if someone invaded, it would take longer to find them, because their purity was considered more important than that of the other people living in the orphanage.
Does a place described in a novel always have to be symbolic? Does it always have to be just to pay attention because this is important? Or can it just be a backdrop, do you think?
I think it often does find its symbolism, but when I'm writing it, I don't consider that usually. I often will see that, yes, someone could read that in a symbolic way, but I don't plant the symbolism, if you know what I mean. It's not a very conscious, deliberate process for me.
I feel like it sits very lightly in your book too, Jennifer. It's like these places don't leap out and take over. They're just, here's where Maggie is and here's what's happening for her at the moment. Was that a hard thing to do, or not so much a part of the writing process, just happened?
It's tricky. It's tricky because it's not something I think about consciously. And I'm deliberating here because it really annoys me when writers sort of talk about writing as though it's some great magic, metaphysical act. And yet I don't have the language to describe the process, because I guess I'm concentrating on the clicky clacky bit, not on the. But no, I think sometimes I totally agree with Christine in that I never in my life, hand on heart, I can say have I kind of been like, I'm going to put them on a lake here because it symbolises such and such and such. But I don't know. Sometimes the more I learn about I'll decide to set a scene in a certain place, and over time, I learn more about it, or I think more deeply about it, and the kind of symbolism of something can be revealed to me. And so, there's a silly little scene in Bodies of Light where a teenage Maggie, I think she's maybe 14 or 15, breaks into a water tower and goes swimming in there with her then boyfriend, who's a much older man. And that was certainly not a symbolic, it was a scene I wrote years ago actually, and I didn't really know if it would make it into the book. and then by the time I got to the, showing it to my editor, she was like, oh, this is this beautiful metaphor for how it's one of those great big hulking cylindrical water towers, and it exists. It's based on a water tower near where my grandparents lived, and I used to live with them. I spent quite a lot of time with them when I was growing up, and I was really frightened of the water tower. I always thought it would fall over or that I would drown in it somehow. I used to have all of these nightmares about it, and so I think it was more like me writing out my own neuroses or something like that. And then my editor was like, no, it's a metaphor for her being way out of her depth with this older man, and trying to, she's never really learnt to swim, so she's kind of dog paddling at the surface of this, monolithic structure on top of a hill, and so I think sometimes there must be something kind of subconscious in there, but at the time I'm writing, I'm kind of just like Scooby-Dooing my way through it, I think.
I love how when she's in New Zealand, Tamarin tells her a story that's located in a particular place. It is on a lake, actually. Yeah. And she takes that story with her later, and it's one of those examples where I realised she's been able to take something with her through her life and kind of root it again somewhere else and make it meaningful somewhere else. It was a lovely moment for me.
I think that was one of the examples where it was on a lake for no reason, really. But then the more I read about the lake, and I was speaking with a Maori friend who happened to know a lot about the history of that area, despite not being from there originally. And the more I learned about it, the more I was like, oh, it's fascinating from a geological perspective. It's fascinating from this kind of cultural and mythological perspective. It's such a site of storytelling and history. And so, I kind of ended up weaving some of that information in because it was too beautiful to leave out.
Sidebar, how hard is it to write in a place like Australia, or really any colonised country, when the story you're telling, like Lucy was saying, is just one of this incredible millefeuille of layers of story that was here already? How do you approach that?
I mean, I think even something like Bodies of Light tells the story largely of somebody who grew up in residential and out-of-home care, and the reality is that it's set in the 70s, but even since that time, the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in state care has increased dramatically. I think it's now between 1 in 2 and 1 in 3 children in out-of-home care is Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and that's bloody dreadful. And so for me, that is something that I don't know. We like to kind of but as a culture, as a country, we like to talk about the kind of colonial history or colonial legacy. But everywhere you look, whether it's at landscape or social structures or these statistics about vulnerable children, about people, being abused or dying in custody. Everywhere you look, it's very clear that that colonial violence is still being perpetrated, and it's very much not a fact of history, or I mean it is, but it's ongoing, is what I'm trying to say, and it kind of continues to be perpetrated, just in slightly different ways, I think. I don't know. That's something it's not even keeping it in mind. It's just it's part of the fabric. If you're writing about contemporary Australia, which is what I do, that's something that informs the writing process as much as the stuff that I was talking about before. Climate and weather patterns and things like that.
Well, Lucy, I can hear you going in the background.
Oh, yeah, sorry. No, I just agree so much with all of that. Yeah, I think it is kind of an insoluble problem in some ways for writers, I think. It's just to hold it in your head and to work out ways of expressing it that are respectful, that don't appropriate, that don't do a whole lot of things, do approach things as well as you can, and it's just an intensely complicated process, as it should be. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking too about how a lot of the people who are unkind or nasty to Kitty and her family on their journey seem to be, however misguidedly, trying to defend their own sense of place and identity, I guess. And so, you know, here are colonisers, descendants of colonisers, refusing access to other people because of a perceived connection to a heartland that's changing. It's a really nuanced picture, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm so aware of people as animals and of us all being territorial in some way, that we're all looking after our little patches, and how few people there are who are willing to give some of their patch up for someone else, for, you know, that to let their way of life deteriorate because it's not fair. And that's the kind of reality that we all face, is that, are we prepared to do that? Well, yeah, I think that would be fair. And, you know, stage 3 tax cuts is a perfect example of that. It's just disgusting, the way they're going. Yeah, I just think there is so much about territory with people, I think.
Yeah, so much that's hard to intellectualise. It's interior. Christine, you got the chance to go to Venice and be in some of these places and perform in some of them. What was that like?
So I had, I was very fortunate because I did go more than once, but the thing about, I guess, because it's such a long way, and obviously now since COVID, you know, we even more understand the uncertainty of future travel. So you don't actually know when you're there if you'll ever come back again. And my main research trip actually was when I had a very small baby, and it kind of sounded very romantic, but it was actually incredibly hard work. So I you know, it was I applied for some funding, and then I got pregnant, and then the funding came, and I remember ringing them up and saying, oh, could I use this to write up the project? And they said, no, you have to do what you set out to do in your application, or we can't let you have it. So I was. My mother-in-law happened to ring me just after I found out about this funding, and I said, oh, I don't suppose you want to come to Venice? And she said, yes. So we kind of, I was lucky, my husband came and his parents, and we kind of muddled along, you know, the baby who was 4 months old but already kind of knew, and I put my coat on, that I was going, and suddenly didn't want to drink milk out of a bottle that I had been expressing in the early morning. So all those kind of challenges. So I think that, and I think that's very relevant. I just feel like when I look back over that book, I can see that I was in that kind of newborn baby headspace, because there are babies everywhere in it.
And some of them are being put in a hole in the wall and having the thing turned around and left behind.
Right. I had to take mine home. But then the strange thing was, I had many, many years of being in that, inside that world in my imagination, but not physically in the space. And that was really weird, because I realised later on that I had changed it. So it's like, you know, when you, they say that when you recall experiences from your life, each time you recall it, it's a little bit different. And that happened to me geographically with these spaces, that I realised that I changed them. And when then in 2016, I went back actually with the Melbourne Women's Choir, and we sang some of this orphanage music in the Pietà Church in Venice, and it was amazing. It was kind of one of those, you know, real kind of very exciting life experiences. But when I went back on that trip, I arrived and I had this really strange sensation that I was actually walking around in my imagination rather than in a real place. And I realised also that my sense of geography was all wrong, and that I had thought things were in a certain location and they weren't, and I got quite lost as well walking around. So I realised that, in fact, you know, in the end, what I've got there, it's not really a representation of Venice so much as a representation of the space inside my head that I was working through when I was writing the book.
I think Venice is a TARDIS. Like, if you walk around it, it's different every day anyway. I think we've got about a minute left, but I want to ask each of you, what is your heartland? I think that's what we've been talking about today, our connection to land. What is it for you, Christine?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that question. My parents are actually Hungarian, and I have a very strong kind of, I feel a strong connection to Europe, and actually probably arriving arriving in Hungary and even in those countries nearby, I do get quite emotional. But obviously I'm very, very connected to my physical home here as well. I live on the Mornington Peninsula and definitely strong sense of attachment to that place as well. So, yeah.
Jennifer, Dandenong.
I mean, yeah, that's where I know the best, perhaps, or like I grew up Mordialloc, Frankston way, so those suburbs. But in terms of where I don't know, I love the most, it's anywhere with mountains, honestly. Like both here and overseas, I kind of instantly feel it's like the effect of putting ice on your wrists or something. When I get into the mountains, I love hiking and I like being up high. Maybe I was like a goat in a past life or something. But yeah, any alpine regions or like the Blue Ridge Parkway in the United States. Like I've only had the fortune to go there once, but there was like a deep, a profound sense of kind of comfort that I felt there. Yeah.
Yeah, I read somewhere that you have this yearning to walk the Appalachian Trail. I was like, oh, I want to do that too.
Yeah.
It's like one day. And Lucy, what about you? Is it in South Australia?
Yeah, I mean, I basically grew up in Victoria, but my mother always hated it, and she always made us feel as though we were living in exile, and it was only as an adult that I came to love it here. We were always kind of waiting for the holidays, and we just would go to this beach house anytime. As soon as the land flattens out, it's just yellow grass and a really big sky. I'm a very happy person. I just think, oh, thank goodness I can breathe again. Yeah.
We were talking before about the drive to Port Fairy and how it just opens up into this big blue sky with a big green landscape. It's lovely. It is lovely talking about place in this place with you today. Thank you so much for coming along, and thank you, Jennifer, Christine and Lucy. It's been wonderful.